Hello everybody, Tito Fox here again with another one of these Fortnite videos and just discussing topics that I find interesting. So today I want to talk about deduction versus induction. And typically when we're talking about deduction or induction, we're talking about deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning. And I think the first part to start off with, because I notice a lot of people kind of get like the two mixed up, or they kind of don't really understand what inductive or deductive reasoning is. So I think the important part to start from for inductive is to start from inductive reasoning and then see how deductive reasoning stems from inductive reasoning. So the order goes: inductive reasoning leads to deductive reasoning, and you'll see why here in a little bit when I get to the examples of it. But so inductive reasoning is, you can look at it, you look at specific cases and you look for a general reasoning, something to kind of like have a general prediction about things. And a good example of this would be if you look at, like, say I take like a pencil and I toss it up in the air, and then I notice that it comes falling back down to the earth. And then say I take like a book and I also throw it up in the air and it comes tumbling back down to the earth. And then say I jump up and I notice that I come back down to earth. From all these specific cases of tossing up the pencil, tossing up the book, tossing myself up in the air, I notice that everything comes back, tumbling back to the earth. So this is inductive reasoning. From looking at these specific cases of the pencil and the book and myself jumping up and coming back down, I have formed this general reasoning that what goes up must come down, which is gravity. So I have induced, that's what inductive comes from. Induced is the word that inductive comes from. And induced means to pull something out of something. And so what we're doing is, in these specific cases with the pencil, the book, and myself, is that we're pulling out this general reasoning. We looked at and we observed these specific cases, these experiments, and we noticed that they had the same outcome. All of them, regardless if you threw them up, came down. And obviously, to add like some little bit of nuances here, it's important to kind of realize that general reasonings do kind of have, to some degree, like scope limitations, and some things that do violate them. For example, a rocket ship is specifically designed to leave Earth's gravitational pull, so that if it's done correctly, it won't come back down. So that kind of violates the general reasoning. Also, some things like light gases don't come back down. So if you fill up a balloon with, helium or hydrogen, that kind of violates the general reasoning too. But they are called general reasonings for specific, for ironically specific reasons. But regardless, to not get too far in that, that does kind of bring in the issue of like scope and nuances to things. But so from induction, you can kind of see where we'll get to start using the next step of reasoning, which is called deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning comes from the opposite end of inductive reasoning. Where inductive reasoning is, you look at specific cases and experiments, and then from there, you derive a general reasoning, a general like rule or principle about something. Deductive reasoning is using the end of it. The end of inductive reasoning. It's using the general reasonings, principles, rules, all that stuff to predict outcomes for specific cases. So a way you could look at it is that for induction reasoning, you go from specific cases to the general reasoning. And for deductive reasoning, you go from general reasonings to specific cases. So for an example, for deductive reasoning, is say during the examples I gave earlier, I tossed up a pencil, a book, and myself in the air. But say if I wanted to toss like a can up in the air, how can I predict the outcome of that? If I want to throw a can up in the air, if I want to throw a basketball or something up in the air too, what would I predict the outcome would be of that? And so if you're thinking, or you're saying to yourself that it would come back and fall back down to Earth, that that gravity would apply to those objects, you're using deductive reasoning. you have deduced what the outcome will be from those general reasonings. And now you can start to see, hopefully you can start to see how inductive and deductive reasoning kind of like play this different roles with one another, where every deduction you have came from induction, like these general rules and general thoughts about things. And it's a lot of different things too. For example, when you think of somebody, like think of like a friend or somebody you don't like or something like that, and you could think about like the character attributes that you attribute to them, like, oh, they're smart or they're lazy, etc., etc. Those things are all inductive reasoning. Like, you've looked at like how they act and behave, and you've noticed like your friend, he always shirks off his like homework. He's not doing what he's supposed to do. He's just playing video games, not doing his homework, not doing his reading or anything that he's supposed to do. And you look at those specific cases, and then you take out that general reasoning from their behavior, from their multitudes of their different behaviors. And then so you've like induced this characteristic about people. So, I mean, that's typically how it works for most people. Most people do things, and then you start to kind of get a general sense of like how somebody is and how someone behaves after multiple times that they've kind of like demonstrated those character attributes. I mean, sometimes you just like associate different attributes with people unfairly because you think you might know them or whatever, but you can see how like inductive and deductive reasoning starts to actually apply to pretty much anything and everything. So if you, just like in the friend example, if you've used your inductive reasoning to think, oh, you know, this person's pretty lazy, and then they get assigned like a new big project at school they have to complete, then using deductive reasoning, you're gonna be like, oh, this guy's not gonna do it, and he's gonna barely do it, and he's gonna get a poor grade on it. So you're using deductive reasoning after you've already used deductive reasoning. So those are pretty important things to kind of think about and to understand. So whenever somebody, another thing is too, when you think about, if someone asks you like your opinion on something too, like, oh, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this or that and stuff, you're usually using like deductive reasoning. So an example would be that is, if you know, I guess if you kind of know anything about like particular fields, you'll have people ask you questions, be like, oh, well, what are you supposed to do in this situation, or like my computer's broken, then you'll use like deductive reasoning to try to like kind of solve those problems. Like, say someone's like computer's like running slow, and then you're like, okay, just reboot the computer, because you're using the general reasoning that rebooting the computer fixes a lot of issues, fixes a lot of problems that people typically have with a computer. So I think that's something that's pretty important to kind of like keep in mind. And it's also useful to kind of think about, is my general reasoning and my deductive skills, is it actually accurate? Because we do make a lot of assumptions, and sometimes our reasonings are based off of like stretches of like logic and reasoning. So sometimes we'll say something, it might sound good, but when we reflect upon it and we actually think about the reasoning behind it and the logic behind it, you're kind of just like, that doesn't really make that much sense. So when you think about like deductive reasoning like that, you will think more so about, okay, I believe that this will be the outcome in this scenario, but what exactly is my general reasoning for that? What exactly backs that up? And especially when you get into things about like evidence and stuff, because it's one thing for you to be thoroughly convinced and talk about this will be the outcome in this like given scenario, but it's completely something different to convince somebody else. Usually you have to give them evidence, which is a form of like inductive reasoning. You have to give them the piece of evidences that you have seen that have convinced you that these will be the actual outcomes. And that's something that could be very difficult, because subconsciously you can take in a lot of information and remember a lot of things, but not consciously be aware of it. So you'll form deductive reasonings about things, and then people ask you, okay, well, why do you think that? What is like your given evidence for that? And you'd be like, oh, I don't know. It might have been things that you might have formed inductive reasonings from things that you read like years ago. You don't even remember. You might not even remember where you got it from. It's like we're not too good about remembering all the small, minute like details, but we are pretty good at like inductive reasoning, even just like naturally and unconsciously. It's pretty ingrained and like natural in people. That's why a lot of people will say that like inductive reasoning is just like a statistical means, basically, meaning that say you have any given like outcome, and this outcome that's produced happens like say like 80% of the time, and then you'll form that general reasoning that, oh, this is the outcome that happens all the time, even though 20% of the time it's wrong. But because our brain induces that general reasoning out of things just from observation, even subconsciously, like we don't even have to be like consciously aware of that stuff to happen. But it is just very important to kind of like keep that stuff in mind. Try to keep that in mind, that inductive reasoning is essentially the evidence that gets you to the deductive reasoning, that gets you to general reasonings. And so to try to, if in very important matters, not everything's important. Like if you think your friend's like lazy, it doesn't really matter too much. You're probably still friends. You probably still hang out, and you probably don't let it affect you guys and your friendship too much. So some things don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. If you form, I would say, essentially like false understandings or like false general reasonings about things, it's not that big of a deal. But in more important matters, say if you're studying like sciences or you're studying anything it's very important for you to fully understand things, you should always kind of like question those inductive reasonings of yours. You should always try to fully understand them and try to understand where they're coming from, because you're trying to form very accurate and precise general reasonings about things. Because you're going to be using your deductive reasoning skills in pretty much anything. If people ask you questions about things, they ask you your opinion or thoughts about things, you're using deductive reasoning. You're not. Think about any time anyone's asked you your opinion about like a person, or like, oh, what would happen in like this case or that case or whatever. Think of how you respond to those. You usually kind of give like a general like vaguish answer, like, oh, I think this is going to happen, or I think that's going to happen. You don't come out to them and say, oh, well, I remember when this specific thing happened and it was similar in this way and that was the outcome of this one, because you don't really remember those inductive reasonings. Instead, you remember the general reasonings about things. You remember the deductive truths, or well, I guess you could say they're truths. If you're, hopefully, it would be preferred if we do have deductive truths rather than deductive reasonings, because reasonings can be wrong, and they do have errors when it comes to things like scope and nuances. And when you study and learn more and more about things, you'll start to kind of realize that there's no totality of truth. Like, there's always nuances that kind of violate rules here and there. It's very, very rare for there to be a simple truth that's 100% correct every single time. And you can kind of see this especially in people who are professionals or people who are very like knowledgeable in certain fields and stuff. You'll ask them a kind of question and they'll be like, oh, well, it depends. So if they say it depends, then you can kind of be somewhat assured that they know more about what they're talking about than someone that just gives you an affirmative yes or no. Because there's always going to be kind of like nuances about things. So, I mean, even going back to like the friend example, everyone's is a very relatable example. Everybody has a friend that's very lazy, that will not do the stuff they want to do. But if people were to ask you like, oh, is your friend lazy? It's like, oh, well, it depends. It's like, if you're talking about schoolwork, yeah, definitely. If you're talking about them, playing video games or hanging out or things like that, you'll probably say no. Because like that same friend, while they're very lazy when it comes to academia and schooling and stuff, they still will, at the drop of a hat, like hang out with you or play games with you and do all these different things. So they're not lazy in everything. And it's the same thing with like general reasonings too. It's like these general reasonings and general truths are just general. They're kind of like true in most cases, but not all cases. There's nuances that violate it. And so it's important for you when you're using deductive reasoning to think about a new specific case, to think about what that deductive reasoning is. What exactly is going on? What exactly are we thinking and stuff? And then from there, you can be more careful and concise with your thoughts and your reasonings. You'll try to avoid saying like a yes or a no in cases where the nuances would dictate the opposite. Which just means, in other words, it just means if you think about your general reasonings that you're using for deductive reasoning, then you'll be more aware of the nuances around it, and you'll be less likely to accidentally use deductive reasoning in cases where it doesn't apply. Just like in the example of like, a rocket ship going outside of the force of gravity, it's like that obviously violates the general rule of what goes up and what goes up must come down. So just be kind of aware of that, and just remember, kind of think about these things, think about deduction, induction, and how they can be helpful. And anyways, I think that's about it for the video. Kind of a funny but tragic end. Didn't exactly know what button to press to open the parachute, or if you can. But thank you all, and have a good day.